All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. This will be the second of 4 shorter lectures on realist fiction, some short stories from the mid-20th century. We're moving from the 50s into the 60s now. And then next week we'll mostly be looking at poetry with a little bit of fiction to begin to discuss the 50s and 60s counterculture as we progress in our course through the second half of the 20th century into the late 20th century, and then to our destination, which is the 21st century. So today's lecture will be on Flannery O'Connor's short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, one of the most famous, probably the most famous short story by one of the most famous and celebrated short story writers of the 20th century. So this is our author, Flannery O'Connor. She lived from 1925 to 1964. She was born in Savannah, Georgia, and lived most of her life in Midgeville, Georgia, with her mother. She had a brief life, as I'll explain in a moment. An important biographical fact about her to understand is that she earned an MFA, a Master of Fine Arts degree in fiction writing in 1947 at the Iowa Writers' Workshop, which was the most prestigious school that granted the Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing degree. That might even still be true, the Iowa Writers' Workshop. And this is an important biographical fact because the MFA degree was fairly new at that time. For the most part, fiction writers and poets and dramatists and creative nonfiction writers, they did not get a degree in creative writing before the mid-20th century. They might have had a degree in literature, they might have just been journalists, maybe who hadn't gone to college. Remember, the mid-20th century, as we discussed with the GI Bill that allowed returning soldiers to get educations, that was what really emphasized the idea that to enter the middle class, you should go to college. So going to college was itself a much more elite thing before the middle of the 20th century. And so, writers might not have gone to college at all. Just thinking of the writers we read in this course. I'm not sure. Did James Baldwin go to college? I don't think so. I don't know that Tennessee Williams did, but you remember it was a very long process. And Elizabeth Bishop did, but Elizabeth Bishop was of a more economically elite status than some of the authors we've read. So the idea that you had to go to college at all to be a writer, and then that you would get a degree in creative writing, was relatively new in the mid-20th century, whereas now most published authors have not only a college degree, but a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing if they're a short story writer, a novelist, a poet. And, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we can talk about over the course of our class. O'Connor was a bit ambivalent about it. She got that degree herself, but somebody said, do you think that getting a degree in writing stifles writers' creativity? Because the idea is writers should be sort of freely imaginative, and if it's something that can just be taught in school, is it really freely imaginative? And her famous quip about that was, it doesn't stifle enough of them, that it's producing too many writers. And then the general context here, the Iowa Writers' Workshop was lately revealed fairly recently to have received a little bit of startup money, you might call it, from the CIA. And we'll have to talk about that, the role of the Cold War and intelligence agencies and espionage played a bigger role than you might be aware of in the development of 20th century literature. I don't want to talk about that right now, though. We will get to that, though. That it's not a conspiracy theory, it's a conspiracy fact, as we'll discuss. But I don't want to talk about that now. But I just want to note that Flannery O'Connor received this degree, and that makes her very exemplary of this growing emphasis in the 20th century on creative writing as a discipline in higher education. And we see that in the first little quote I've placed from the Norton bio of O'Connor on my slide, which talks about how the textbook understanding fiction became her Bible. So the idea of learning how to write. And she herself then later became an exemplary short story writer, taught as one of the finest examples of the craft of short fiction. And I'm sure you read that story. You could see, if you maybe only read it once, but if you read it twice, you'll see there's a very delicate patterning of motifs. Everything is foreshadowed. It's very very tightly crafted. So that's one thing about her that is important. Another thing about her life that was important is that she was a devout Catholic, and that she, like James Baldwin, saw fiction as having an almost religious mission, though for Baldwin it was that fiction art would replace religion as what brought people together. O'Connor saw the relationship a bit differently because Baldwin left his faith. O'Connor remained within her faith and wanted to use fiction in certain ways to dramatize the issues of faith. And I think, there's a hesitancy about saying this because it sounds like you're being too blunt or something, but I'm not afraid of being too blunt. I think she probably wanted, in certain ways, to use fiction to not only awaken readers, but to maybe in a certain way convert readers, to make readers aware of the necessity of faith. And she did this in stories that emphasize the ugly side of life without faith, and we'll talk about that in a moment. She, again, had a short life. She published 2 novels and a number of short stories that were collected in 2 collections, and those were the only books she published because she died at age 39 from lupus, which her father also died of. I think it's a largely hereditary illness, and she had lupus for most of her adult life, and so that struggle with the body is something that I think comes up in her work. The idea of the sort of the ambivalences of being an embodied person, and you see the picture of her there. She raised peacocks with her mother on the Midgeville, Georgia farm. So the peacock is often the emblem of Flannery O'Connor's life. She's considered, again, one of the great short story writers of the 20th century. She's also particularly seen as kind of a hero among Catholic literary intellectuals. And by the way, as I think you'll see, this interest in the outsider that we talked about at the very beginning of the course, almost every writer we've read so far has in some way been an outsider to what was the dominant white Anglo-Saxon Protestant straight male culture that reigned in the early 20th century. I'm not sure we've read a writer yet that could be described with all of those adjectives: white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, straight, male. Every single writer we've read so far is not one or more of those. And so Catholic writers coming into prominence in the middle of the 20th century, alongside African-American writers like James Baldwin, or queer writers like Elizabeth Bishop or Tennessee Williams, or, as we'll discuss in the next lecture, Jewish American writers like Philip Roth. This was a time of growing diversification of who was on the literary scene. That dominant culture's hold on the culture was fading away. So O'Connor's Catholicism, I think, is emblematic. She also wrote in the Southern Gothic genre as well as the realist genre, and we already talked about Southern Gothic with Tennessee Williams. So again, just to repeat, a genre of fiction or drama set in the American South, emphasizing the region's grim history, slavery, the Civil War, poverty, and the grotesque horror and alienation of its inhabitants' lives. And O'Connor really leaned into that idea of the grotesque, which we'll discuss on the next slide. She originally, my second excerpt from the Norton bio, she originally wanted to be a cartoonist, and there's something in her writing of cartoonishness. The kids in A Good Man Is Hard to Find are reading these comic books, and there's something of the sort of shocking crime and horror comics of the mid-20th century in her work that were very gruesome, and that eventually led to comics being censored, as we will discuss when we talk about Art Spiegelman later. But there's something of that in her. So why did she emphasize this grotesquerie, particularly as a Catholic writer? So one of the reasons, I think, and I've labeled what she's doing the Christian grotesque, is that she was interested in emphasizing the uglier side of life to demonstrate what life was like without faith and redemption. So what does the word grotesque mean? If you look at the quote, I have 3 quotes on this slide. The quote in the middle is from a glossary of literary terms, a kind of textbook that provides definitions of literary terms. And the authors, Abrams and Harpham, describe, they have a long definition of the grotesque, but I've just taken out a bit. The concept of the grotesque has been extended to refer to anything unnatural, strange, absurd, ludicrous, distorted, wildly fantastic, or bizarre. And the characters and events in O'Connor's stories are always unnatural, strange, absurd, ludicrous, distorted, wildly fantastic, or bizarre. They're realist in that they take, her stories take place in the modern day South and nothing supernatural happens, and they're written in a straightforward style, but they're really kind of a heightened realism. And a heightened realism so that the characters are kind of a twisted, caricatured version of people you'd meet in real life. And why did she do this? Well, she has an essay called On Some Aspects of the Grotesque in Southern Fiction, where she explains, whenever I'm asked why Southern writers particularly have a penchant, that is a preference or a specialty, in writing about freaks, I say it is because we are still able to recognize one. To be able to recognize a freak, you have to have some conception of the whole man. And in the South, the general conception of man is still in the main theological. So in other words, she writes about distorted characters as a way of demonstrating what life is like, how distorted life can be when you get away from a theological conception of the human being. So the quote-unquote freak, that's probably not a polite word we'd want to use these days, but that's what she uses. So those characters represent, in essence, life without God. And she says, the South is Christ-haunted. This idea of the South being a great arena for the fiction writer because it's a region of the country where this religious idea, this theological conception lingers more than in other parts of the country, especially the much more secularized industrial North with its bastions of higher learning and its centrality of media. The North is this sort of bastion of secularity, but the South retains this religious conception. But the idea of the grotesque in her writing sort of works on every level. The characters on the largest scale are grotesque, and what happens to them is grotesque, is distorted, is twisted. But even her little micro descriptions are grotesque. Her style is grotesque. So, for instance, the third thing on my slide that I've taken from the story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, is the description of the children's mother on the first page. A young woman in slacks whose face was as broad and innocent as a cabbage and was tied around with a green headkerchief that had 2 points on top like a rabbit's ears. So you see what these two similes have you thinking of this person in terms of a cabbage with rabbit's ears. Now, is that not a grotesque image? So she describes her characters using figurative language to emphasize their grotesque characteristics. Why? Because she wants to make you, I just want to put this very bluntly. I don't know, academia makes things too complicated. She's describing people as grotesque because she wants to make you think of what's not grotesque, which is God, which is Jesus. That's her purpose. That's not grotesque. And that's what she wants to direct your attention toward by having you avert your eyes from the grotesquerie of the world as she describes it. So A Good Man is Hard to Find. Sorry for that image, but I'm interested, remember, in these paperbacks, these kind of sensationalist paperbacks that brought literature to the masses in the mid-20th century. So this is an early paperback edition of the short story collection, A Good Man is Hard to Find, in which the story was published in 1955. It's her most famous short story, and it exhibits her characteristic style and themes. So we already talked about her grotesquerie, her dark humor, her exaggerated, strange characters, and events that are so extreme they become funny. That's another thing in her work. She writes about horrible things that happen to people, but they're so over-the-top horrible that they flip from horror into comedy because it just becomes absurd. And so there's a kind of absurdist horror in her work. She's been extremely influential on filmmakers, by the way. I see a lot of Flannery O'Connor in like the Coen brothers or directors like that who also use this grotesque, dark humor. So we already talked about that. So moving to my first bullet point there, her almost cinematic storytelling, focusing on external events and dialogue with just the occasional flourish of figurative language or insight into characters' thoughts. So I think O'Connor is a writer in whom you can really see another theme of this course overall, which is how literature responds to rival media. In O'Connor, you really see, I think, the influence that cinema had on literature. She's writing stories that almost read at times like screenplays. They're mostly just external action and dialogue, but she'll occasionally give you this flourish of figurative language, like the one we just saw about the cabbage and the rabbit's ears, or she'll occasionally tell you what a character is thinking. It's A Good Man is Hard to Find is in the third person. I would call it limited, third person limited. She tells us what the grandmother's thinking a couple times, and I don't think any other character. The other thing, just going down my list of the characteristics of O'Connor as a writer, a portrayal of sudden violence that intrudes on the lives of complacent people and shocks them toward existential awareness. So generally her stories tend to be about people who are just going about their lives, and she represents these lives as kind of grotesque, kind of stupid, kind of contemptible, and then violence enters that normal, contemptible, everyday life and snaps the people out of the spell of the everyday and shocks them into confronting what they most need to confront, which is the question of their existential alienation and the religious salvation that alone could be the solution of it. So that's this sudden violence to be a shock toward existential awareness. Like James Baldwin, Flannery O'Connor thinks that it's not something she can respect or admire if you just live an everyday normal life and never think about these big questions. So the two writers are linked in that way. Another aspect of her work is she writes about the South and she satirizes, that is to say, mocks, makes fun of, criticizes the South. Why? For its nostalgia, the same thing we saw in A Streetcar Named Desire in Tennessee Williams's critique of the South, this nostalgia for the old days, even though the old days were a very unequal society based, in slavery, this nostalgia for plantation living and things like that. So she makes fun of that. She makes fun of the South's racism, the white South's racism toward African Americans. She makes fun of the lack of sophistication found there, combined with the kind of arrogance, the racist arrogance, the class-based arrogance. So she likes the thing she likes about the South is the retention of this theological conception of the human being, but these social and political characteristics she doesn't like, and she persistently mocks. And again, the emphasis on religious themes, the spiritual emptiness of modern life, and the need for grace and redemption. And I think if you want to understand the story A Good Man is Hard to Find and what it's about, I find this quotation helpful. It's from the 19th century Christian philosopher, Christian existentialist philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, in his book Fear and Trembling, in which he writes, "There dwells infinitely more good in a demoniac, that is, someone possessed by a demon, than in a trivial person." And why is that? Well, because I think the idea here is you could be a good person who's just good out of habit, and you never think about any big questions, and thus you don't have an active goodness or an active faith. And it's better actually to be evil than to be a complacently good person, because at least the evil person who's chosen the demonic side knows that good and evil exist, and knows that the battle raging between good and evil concerns them, and thus they are halfway back to God, whereas the merely trivial person isn't even aware of these forces. And I think that's the frame in which you should see this story. That's why the misfit, who's the villain of the story and who does nothing good in the story and is incredibly evil, is in some ways preferable to the main character, the grandmother, because she's a trivial person. I think that's what Flannery O'Connor is getting at. So she's a tough writer. This is tough stuff. This isn't you're not being told some simple moral thing you already believe when you read her story. She's a shocking writer, and she wants to shock because she wants to lift your eyes to this existential, religious horizon. So let's get some more detail on that. Let's understand a little bit more how she does this in the story. So I'm not going to retell the plot because it's very simple. This family ends up going on a road trip. They're eventually waylaid by this escaped killer, and he kills the whole family. It's when you say it that way, it's a pretty depressing story. But the way she tells it, it's different. It's not merely depressing. So I want to point out again, I want to look at a few passages to prove what I said on the last slide about her satire of Southern nostalgia and complacency. And the portrait of the grandmother really sets this up. The grandmother is a little bit like if Blanche Dubois had no redeeming characteristics. If Blanche Dubois didn't have this saving grace of her romanticism, but was simply a bigot from the plantation. That's a little bit like what the grandmother is like. So when she goes on this road trip, she settled herself comfortably, removing her white cotton gloves, etc., etc. She had white violets on the brim of her hat. She had white organdy trimmed with lace at her neckline. And why was she so dressed up when they're just going on this road trip in the car? In case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. And so this is her arrogance, her nostalgia, her complacency. She wants to be seen, even if she's dead. She doesn't care if she lived a good life. She doesn't care about the state of her soul. She just wants to be, if she's dead on the highway, she wants them to know that she was a lady. So this complacency, this nostalgia, and that replicates itself in other characters even further down the class scale in the story. So when they meet Red Sammy, when they go to his lunch place, him and the grandmother, he and the grandmother have a conversation about, the way the world's going to hell, essentially. And he says the title of the story, "A Good Man is Hard to Find. Everything is getting terrible. I remember the day you could go off and leave your screen door unlatched, not no more." And that was a cliche even in the 50s. The idea that there was a time you could leave your door unlocked. People still to this day say that. People who are roughly my age say, when I was a kid, you could leave your door unlocked. No, you couldn't. You really couldn't. But people were saying that even 70 years ago. That's always been a cliche. So these characters are just spouting cliches. They have no original thoughts. They're complacent. They're just repeating this stuff they heard that's just crap. And so she's making fun of this. So the title of the story is in that sense a joke, that it's just this cliche that people say, as if they were talking about the weather or something. And yet there's a seriousness to it as well. Because, the story wants us to ask, what is a good man? What is a good person? And that comes back when the grandmother is confronted with the misfit, and she says to him, "I know you're a good man. You don't look a bit like you have common blood." So to her, a good man is a man who has elite blood. So you see this class, caste, racist idea she has in mind of what goodness is. It's your bloodline. It's what family you belong to. That's what's a good man to her. And, the story's making fun of that idea. The story's rejecting that. The story's saying, no, to be a good person is a much more arduous task, open to anyone, though most people don't meet the standards. And it doesn't have anything to do with whether you come from common blood, quote unquote. So this is where we can see O'Connor's satire, her mockery of these aspects of Southern life she doesn't like. And she also satirizes modern nihilism, that is, belief in nothing, more broadly, as it exists not just in the South. And she does it brilliantly, I think, and you see her really kind of dark humor most clearly through the portrayal of the children, Wesley and June Starr. who are just these little tiny little nihilists who never say a nice, kind thing throughout the story. They just read their comic books and just, hurl these really cutting, brutal insults to everybody they're talking to. And I think the moment where you see O'Connor's humor best, I think, is when the car wrecks and the children run out and they say, "We've had an accident," the children screamed in a frenzy of delight. "But nobody's killed," June Star said with disappointment. So these children they have so little belief in anything, so little moral compass, that they just delight in horrible things happening. They take no pleasure in good things happening. And if this is the generation that's coming up, well, the world is headed toward nihilism. Nihilism is also shown when the misfit is telling his life story. He says, he committed some crime and he doesn't know what it is. He doesn't remember. And he says he calls himself the misfit because he can't make what he did fit with what they did to him, burying him alive, he says, in the prison. And he says it was a head doctor, i.e. a psychologist, a psychiatrist, at the penitentiary said what I had done was kill my daddy. And that could really use a footnote from the Norton editors there. What he's referring to is something we talked a little bit about with A Streetcar Named Desire, which was the way that Freudian psychoanalysis became the dominant psychological school in the mid-20th century. And a key part of Freud's theory was that you, especially if you were a man, you went from, you grew up feeling this rivalry for your father. So you had this aggression against your father. And so the idea O'Connor's getting at is that the misfit has committed a crime and also a sin, but they can't talk to him at the level of the soul. They can't talk to him at the level of redemption. They have to apply these secular theories of psychoanalysis that don't really get to the level at which the soul experiences the battle of good and evil. So in that way, she's satirizing modern nihilism. So she's very unlike Tennessee Williams, who I think really, in many ways, adopts Freud's way of thinking about the human being and is not a religious writer, as O'Connor is. And then the other thing is the grandmother says to him, "Think how wonderful it would be to settle down and live a comfortable life." And that as much for James Baldwin as for Flannery O'Connor is something they disagree with, they disapprove of. Your goal should not be to live a comfortable life. If that's your goal, then you are guilty of evading the question of your soul. And that's nihilistic. You're just pursuing pleasure, you're just pursuing ease, you're just pursuing comfort. That's nihilistic. And that's what she's criticizing. So then what is the option then? What should you do if you don't give in to complacency, nostalgia, nihilism? Well, the misfit says it. The misfit is the kind of theologian of the story. He's the sort of preacher of the story, even though he's an evil character. And he says, Jesus was the only one that ever raised the dead. And he shouldn't have done it. He thrown everything off balance. If he did what he said, then it's nothing for you but throw away everything and follow him. And if he didn't, then it's nothing for you to do but enjoy the few minutes you got left the best way you can. By killing somebody, or burning down his house, or doing some other meanness to him. No pleasure but meanness. So the misfit says, really nihilism is the consequence of atheism. If you don't believe in God, says the misfit. I feel like I'm giving a sermon. I'm not giving a sermon. This is a very influential short story, and I'm trying to explain to you the meaning of it. We'll get to some atheist writers later if that's more your style. I don't know. But anyway, the point is, nihilism is the result of atheism. If you don't believe in God, then there's no reason to behave any particular way. So if you don't believe in the Christian tradition that Jesus was the Son of God and raised the dead and came back, resurrected, if you don't believe any of that, then why should you believe anything at all? There's no transcendent truth. And if there's no transcendent truth, well, why not kill people? Why not rob people? So really, O'Connor she's not a very moderate thinker. She says you basically have two options. You can believe in God and approach to goodness, or you cannot believe in God, and at the end of that line you become a killer. But the good thing about the misfit, this outsider character who doesn't fit into society, is that he recognizes this. He gets this. And in getting it, he's closer to God than the grandmother, who doesn't do anything exceptionally evil, though she is a bad person. But she's not even aware that this is an issue until she's confronted with the misfit. And that leads to the misfit's famous line of dialogue. This is one of the most famous lines of dialogue in American literature. After he kills the grandmother, he said, "She would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life." And the meaning of that is, if you live your life as if it were about to come to an end, you will live it in this state of maximal awareness of the existential question of the battle for good and evil over your soul. And in that way, you will be a better person than if you just act as if, oh, well, ho-hum, I'm living my life, and none of these questions concern me. So we would all be good people if there were someone there to shoot us. We would all be good people if we were confronted with this extreme situation that made us ask this question. So the final question for me is, that's the misfit. He's a character who sort of gives, in a way, O'Connor's kind of theological premise, but does the grandmother change or grow as a character? Is she a round character that changes and grows, or does she remain this flat caricature of this bigoted old racist white lady who's wants everybody to think that she's a proper lady? I think there's a glimmer of awareness at the end, and I think she does grow. And I want to introduce a vocabulary word here, which is epiphany. So this is a term that means a manifestation or showing forth that by Christian thinkers was used to signify a manifestation of God's presence in the world. But it was secularized as a literary term by the Irish writer, James Joyce, who used it to signify this sense of sudden radiance and revelation that occurs during the perception of a commonplace object. And so Joyce's short stories and novels include a number of epiphanies, etc. Epiphany has become the standard term for the description, recurrent in modern poetry and prose fiction, of the sudden flare into revelation of an ordinary object or scene. So it's become almost a cliche that a modern or contemporary short story will end with an epiphany, will end with this sudden moment of radiance or clarity where everything falls into place and makes some sense. And I think, and again, I'm quoting here from the glossary of literary terms that I was quoting a few slides ago. And I think we'll see many epiphanies over the course of the semester. We'll probably see the use of the epiphany go from a vital technique to a kind of cliched technique, in fact, I think. But O'Connor was still using it when it was a very vital technique. And of course, epiphany religiously meant something to her, as it did not to Joyce, who left his Catholic faith. So the grandmother, I think, experiences an epiphany just before she is killed. She saw the man's face twisted close to her own, and as if he were going to cry, and she murmured, "Why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children." She reached out and touched him on the shoulder. The misfit sprang back as if a snake had bitten him and shot her 3 times through the chest. So I want to focus on that line of dialogue. You're one of my babies. You're one of my own children. I think this means 3 things. Number 1 is confusion. She's been lapsing into confusion at the trauma of these events throughout the second half of the story, and the misfit has, by this time in the story, put on the shirt her son was wearing. So when she reaches out and touches him, she's seeing him in her son's shirt, and so there's a confusion. She thinks it's her son. That's number one. Number two, though, I think there's two symbolic meanings. Number two is this is the moment where she realizes that this vicious killer is the product of the nihilistic, complacent society of which she is a member. That her complacency and nihilism that manifests itself in her everyday life has given birth to this nihilism that goes abroad killing people. So she recognizes her complicity in the evil of the society that has created this character. And then I think and that's a very negative epiphany. There might also be a positive epiphany. You're one of my own children. Well, maybe that's her spiritual epiphany. Maybe she, who has never thought seriously about religious or existential questions, has had this religious epiphany that, as the Christian line says, all men are brothers. We're all related. We're all children of God. And so she regards him as her kin, as her spiritual kin. She reaches out to try to connect with him on that level. And maybe at that moment, and then he kills her, and maybe at that moment she has advanced over him in existential awareness and in nearness to God. So those are the three potential meanings. It's ambivalent. It's ambiguous. We don't quite know what it means. O'Connor is not simply a dogmatic writer trying to preach us into a religious conversion. That's not what she's about. So her stories often have these open endings, and sometimes you can just enjoy them on the level of their dark humor. I think my favorite comment on Flannery O'Connor was Toni Morrison, who we're going to read later in the semester, really admired Flannery O'Connor, and she described her as wonderfully hostile. And I think that's a great way of summing up her work. It's wonderful. It's so imaginative. It's so funny. It's so interesting, but it's very hostile, and it's very hostile to our everyday lives. It wants us to look above them, to rise above them. But in that sense, note, she has a very ambitious mission for fiction, just as James Baldwin did. Though for him, fiction replaces art. For her, art... let me rephrase. For him, fiction replaces religion. It becomes the thing that brings us together now that we can't, being modern people, believe in religion anymore. For her, she wants to reestablish religion in our lives, and so fiction serves that by forcing us to confront what our lives actually are. And that's Flannery O'Connor. Thanks very much, and have a great day.